Hello and welcome to my video for the new approaches in psychology topic, which is part of the new AQA 2015 specification. What I aim to do today is to provide you some sort of an overview of what's involved in the topic and look through the first part of the approaches topic, which is the origins of psychology. So it kind of takes a look back through the history. So first thing we'll do then is have a quick look at the specification. So this is what AQA say you will need to know as part of this topic. It changes slightly between the first year AS and the second year. And there are a couple of bits that you will only need for the second year. These are the last three bullet points: the psychodynamic approach, the humanistic approach, and the comparisons of the approaches. I'm going to go through all of them in these series of videos, hopefully. So whether you are doing the year one or year two or both, these should be helpful for you. As you can see, the first thing you'll need, and as I said, what we're going to go over today, is the origins of psychology. So this looks at, well, what is psychology? Where did it come from? What's the history? So I'm going to have a look at a bit of a timeline as kind of what went before, what has there been, and kind of where are we now. And specifically looking at Wilhelm Wundt and his idea of introspection and his first lab in Leipzig in Germany, and as well looking at the scientific approach and seeing how psychology has gone from maybe being several different aspects to being one. Well, maybe that can be debated, but one kind of approach which is unified really with the scientific approach, and we'll look at kind of some evaluations towards those. From the rest of the spec, you look at really classic psychological principles, a learning theory, really important, and I will hopefully be doing some further videos that will look at those different aspects. So you need to look at the learning theory, behaviorist psychology, cognitive psychology, which is all about thinking processes, and biological psychology as well. And as I previously mentioned, you also for year two need the psychodynamic approach and humanistic psychology, as well as the comparisons. So I know some people will be doing year one and be sitting an exam in their first year. Some people won't, and it will be a linear qualification. So it's just about kind of knowing what you need to know, what you can be assessed on in each of those, but hopefully that will become more clear. Okay, so now we've had a chance to look at the specification. Let's get started with looking at this origins then. So what is psychology? Where does it come from? And I think one of the first things to do when trying to determine that is, well, you need to look at the word itself and look at where maybe that has derived from. Ask the question, what is psychology? Well, the word itself has come from two Greek words. The first being psyche, which translated to mind, and the second being logos, which translated to the study of. So if anything, if you look at any subject and it's got an ology, biology, psychology, trying to think of more, I'm sure there are, just got psychology on the brain, what can I say? Anything that's an ology, it's the study of. So the literal translation of the word psychology is the study of the mind. However, nowadays we understand it as being a bit more complicated than that, and as you'll see as this topic goes on, there's lots more to it in terms of behaviour, in terms of thinking, in terms of biology, and that's really what psychology encapsulates these days. But obviously where the word came from, that's the basis of it. There's also this symbol at the top here, and that is the Greek letter psi, psi, and again that meant mind. So if you see that symbol, I think it's on the spine of some of the textbooks and things like that, you might see it quite often. That sign represents the subject, psychology, because it was this Greek letter which translated to mind and psychology. Okay, so what we have here then is a history of psychology, looking at a timeline, so basically from its very basic origins, and then through the different approaches that we'll be looking at in much more detail through this whole topic. And as you can see there, early psychology, from really pretty much from the dawn of time, people have been thinking about, why do people act the way they act? Why do people think the way they think? And there have been lots of different approaches that have explored that. And do we call that psychology? Well, maybe, maybe not. And as we go through this topic, again, you'll have a better understanding of how that's actually now been refined into an overall topic. What we had were kind of early psychology, and this is before maybe the term psychology, before anyone had ever mentioned the word psychology or there had ever been a psychologist. As I said, people were thinking about, well, what's causing these people to have issues? Obviously, there would have still been mental health problems, still been people acting in different ways to other people. So society would have looked at, well, how has that happened? And I've got 3 examples there. The first is Trepanning, and this is where in kind of medieval times, even before that, you see there, that's quite early, 500 BC, earliest examples of trepanning happening, and this is where a hole was drilled into the skull of people that they thought had mental health problems, and there have been various reasons for this. Some people, it was assumed that they thought it was a build-up of fluid that were causing people to act strangely. In kind of medieval times, it was maybe thought that it was almost nasty, evil spirits that were within the person, and so they were drilling the hole to let these spirits out. And so I guess this can almost be thought of as the earliest kind of psychology, looking at, well, how are people acting and how can this change? There's another term there, humorism, and this is where, which is demonstrated in that picture at the bottom there. This was thought about 400 BC. It was thought that the different fluids that we had in our body can make us act in different ways, and if people had maybe more blood or more bile than some others, so it was yellow bile, black bile, phlegm and blood were seen as the 4 main bodily fluids that determined how we acted, and people's behaviour can be described and explained using different amounts of these fluids that they thought they had. And then up to the 1st century, there was a condition called wandering womb syndrome, which explained why all women are crazy, apparently. So after these early psychological ideas, then came the job of looking at and explaining human behaviour and human thinking came to the philosophers. And what we would probably describe today as psychology would have been known as experimental philosophy between the 17th and the 19th centuries. And you had philosophers such as René Descartes, who came up with the idea of Cartesian dualism, which is the idea that the mind and the body are separate things. And with that view, it means that you can study the mind as a separate entity, whereas before it would have all been seen as the same. And with studying the mind as a separate entity, again, you can see how that may have then led to psychology and the subject as it is at the moment. You also had John Locke, another philosopher, who came up with the idea of empiricism, and that is the idea that behaviour is observed and measurable, and he had the idea that we're not born with any predispositions, and that we inherit. We don't inherit knowledge, we don't inherit anything, and we get that from our environment. And as you'll see later, this has been developed by a particular branch of psychologists known as behaviourists, and they took that idea a little bit further. And then the philosophers kind of lead us to Charles Darwin. I guess could have been seen as a bit of a philosopher as well, obviously famous scientist, looking at the role of innate and adaptive environments, and how if something would have allowed you to survive in your environment, it would have then been passed on. And so he would suggest we are a product of adaptive advantages, and that all led to the way we act and the way we think as we know it now. So those are kind of so you've got those early psychological ideas, and you've then got the philosophers. What then came, and where we're really going to start the journey of psychology, is Wilhelm Wundt, and he is the first person in history who was known as a psychologist. So really we can see the birth of psychology with Wilhelm Wundt's ideas. In 1879 he opened the first experimental psychological lab in Leipzig in Germany, and this was the first lab and the first time that the human body and the human mind and behaviour and why we act how we act was experimentally studied. Anyway, the first time that it was documented, and he was very concerned, and we'll look into a bit more detail on him after we've gone over this timeline, with kind of people's actions and actually their thinking about their actions. He called this introspection, but as I said, there's more on that a bit later. Next then came psychodynamic psychology, and probably I say Wilhelm Wundt was the first psychologist, probably the most famous psychologist. Then came with psychodynamic psychology, and that was Sigmund Freud, and his ideas were more to do with the unconscious mind, the role of childhood, and how our upbringing has an effect on how we act and how we behave later in life. However, some of his ideas were criticised as being untestable, unobservable, and that then led to the behaviourists and what we know as the learning approach to psychology, B.F. Skinner, Ivan Pavlov, and they very much took, well, no, we have to see what we observe. Again, they would have come from John Locke's idea of empiricism, that we gain a lot from our environment. However, the behaviourists were criticised, particularly by the next branch of psychology that sprung up, and you'll start noticing a pattern here. What happens is that an idea will become popular and favourable. There'll then be criticisms of that, and based on those criticisms, kind of another view comes. However, yeah, as I was saying, the behaviourists were criticised as, because it was very experimental, obviously they had to then take people out of their environment, and it was almost a lot of lab settings. It lacked what we called external validity, and so they were criticised for not looking at the individual and saying, actually, the individual is important here. We can't just look at particular behaviours, we have to look at the whole person, and so the next approach did just that, looked at the whole person within psychology, and that was known as humanistic psychology. Very famously came Maslow's hierarchy of needs from that, which says that how a human needs to progress and particular needs need to be met. Again, further criticisms of even psychodynamic and behaviourists and maybe even humanistic came from cognitive psychologists, who said that actually none of this has taken into account the thinking that goes on, what's actually going on in the brain in terms of thinking processes. And so cognitive psychology focuses very much on that, on the processes that go on in the brain. And then the biological psychologists came in, and this is kind of almost, I guess, the new ground that's being discovered. Don't get me wrong, there are still psychologists in each of these different approaches, but this is kind of how it's progressed over time, and the kind of biological, I guess, was what is one of the most recent in terms of kind of neuroscience, functional imaging, so we can see kind of what areas of the brain are activated doing what tasks. That was a lot of information there. Don't worry too much if you haven't taken absolutely everything in. I was going through giving you a bit of a summary intentionally, because actually each of the psychodynamic, the behaviourist, humanistic, the cognitive, and the biological approach, you need to go into more detail, and there'll be specific lessons or specific things you will go into more detail on. That was just to kind of give you an overview of how it kind of fits into the history of psychology, and as the title of this lesson is, the origins, where it's come from and kind of where it's going to. For the rest of the video then, we're going to go into a bit more detail over, this is about the origins, so we're going to start at the beginning. The first psychologist, Wilhelm Wundt. As I said, his ideas of human behaviour are quite important and have kind of led us to where we are now. Okay, so Wilhelm Wundt, as I said, first psychologist, first person to be known as a psychologist, and he had this lab open in Leipzig in Germany. And what it is that actually made him special is that he was the first to kind of purposely look at human behaviour and think the mind was a subject for study, and actually to put scientific methods onto this, actually scientifically study it, rather than the philosophers and things that had gone before, who were almost thinking about these things. He actually tested these particular things. And the sorts of things that he was interested in studying were reaction times, sensation, perception. What I mean by perception, they'd be given maybe an image to look at, or made to listen to a tone, and asked kind of what that made them think. We'll go into more detail about that. But what this was known as, almost breaking the human mind down into different structures, it developed its own term, and that was known as structuralism. So he said that he wanted to study the structure of the human mind by breaking it down into all these separate little bits, such as reaction time and sensation and perception. And that term of breaking these things down was known as structuralism. As I said, the way he did this was by getting lots of different people, and actually, again, they were known as participants, and actually he'd present them with the same information. He'd present them with the same tone or the same picture. One thing he did was present them with a metronome that keeps beats, and what he would do is ask them what they were thinking when they were presented with that particular stimulus. And he could then compare different people's ideas of what they said they were thinking at that time. The process of people saying what they were thinking, it was known as introspection. They were looking into themselves, hence the intro. They were trying to determine what processes were going through themselves, and as I said, he could then compare this from different people. So did everyone see that particular picture as the same thing? Did they hear that tone as the same tone? Did they have the same experiences of that metronome? But this introspection, the way he did this by asking them to do it, was quite unique, and actually, as we'll go on to look at, it has been criticised because it could potentially be fairly subjective. But this was the method he used, and actually the fact that it was controlled, he was using the same stimulus, he could have standardised instructions, which means that he told each of the participants, to do the same thing. That was good because it allowed comparison, replicability, which is one of the cornerstones of the scientific method, and we'll go into a little more detail on that. So yeah, you do need to know what introspection was. I've given you a lot of these examples anyway. So individuals are asked to look at their own conscious thoughts and emotions to explore them and understand them. So it's not just saying, here's a picture, it's saying, well, what does that picture make you feel? What does it mean to you? And it was known as exploring that individual's inner world. What are they thinking? And I've given you those examples as well. So shown an image or played a sound, and what processes are going through their mind. Is it a high pitched sound? Does that have a different meaning to them than a low pitched sound would? And as I say, you could then compare people's different responses to these things, and that's what introspection is. As you should be starting to understand, psychology then has, I guess, progressively moved towards potentially being more scientific. There is still a debate about this, and I'll probably be criticised if I come down on one side or another, but there is some evidence that psychology has become more scientific, yet there are still sections, such as the humanists, who believe that shouldn't have happened. You know, as I said, looking at the timeline, we've gone from looking at medieval times, maybe thinking about psychology as being people being possessed, and then into philosophers looking at the thinking about it. Actually, with the introduction of Wilhelm Wundt and his laboratory, we've definitely got more of a scientific emphasis onto the subject, which is definitely a good thing. So the method of introspection was good. It was the start of the scientific process, in that it was replicable, and I've already spoke about that. So what that means is that you can have the same process can be given to different people, different participants, and looked at whether we're finding the same results or different results. That's one of the cornerstones of science, is replicability. And so Wundt actually did have that aspect towards his understanding. However, he was criticised with introspection, as introspection was seen as very subjective. What one person said isn't necessarily, we're actually fairly poor at understanding why or how we think about things. And so for his main method, this introspection, looking at the internal world of individuals, that's not necessarily a good thing. But psychology in general, and again, hopefully you saw that from the timeline at the beginning, has moved to try and be more scientific. So actually, what the vast majority of approaches in psychology have adopted now are the empirical method. So this is where we can make predictions and test those predictions. We can look at cause and effect, which means, does one thing have an effect on another? And actually, if you look at the scientific method that is now used, so there are three important things that determine whether something is scientific and whether it uses the scientific method or not. And those are objectivity, being systematic, and being replicable. What objectivity means is that it's fact. You can dispute it, it's testable, observable. You can say, right, I'm pretty sure, for example, that coffee improves attention or reaction time because, look, here's the data, I can repeat it, and you can repeat it and get the same results. That's how we know something is fact, and that's kind of part of the scientific method. And so actually the almost the opposite of objectivity is subjectivity, is matter of opinion. So actually Wundt was criticised as maybe being a bit subjective and not objective, but actually some of the other approaches in psychology, particularly maybe behaviorist or cognitive, are certainly objective. You can look at things, you can test them and say, yeah, look, this is how it is, this is how someone behaves. If you offer them a treat, they're more likely to repeat that behavior in the future. Systematic means that there's a procedure, obviously with scientific journals and standardized instructions, where we can have a specific procedure that will test particular aspects. You'll look at the attachment topic, and there's a procedure in there called the strain situation. That is systematic, because it can happen time and time again. That's a procedure that you can follow. And again, replicable. And what replicable means is that a method can be repeated and you can get the same results. And that has happened in the vast majority of scientific approaches. And actually, it's becoming more and more, so more and more popular. So if you go back to that timeline and look at the different approaches, and as I've already said, you will go into more detail and hopefully see how this scientific method applies to them. But the behaviorists certainly use the scientific method. Cognitive psychologists tend to as well, and psychobiologists also certainly do. So actually what we can see now is that psychology is seen as more of a science than potentially it may have been. This has been reflected at university degrees. Used to get a BA in psychology, which is a Bachelor of the Arts. You're now getting more BScs, Bachelor of Sciences, if you're doing a psychology qualification. So it's been reflected in society as well. So that kind of hopefully answers the part. I'll go back to the spec at the end, but answers the part of looking at psychology as a science. To give you a little bit of evaluation then, kind of AO2 or AO3 points, we'll look at the two different things really that we've looked in more detail at in this video, and that's Wundt and the scientific method. So a couple of evaluative points then. You kind of know, hopefully you've got a bit of an understanding now of who Wundt was, what he did. So to evaluate what he did, and again, I've already said I think the majority of this, but to get it down in specific points, his early work has been criticised as being unscientific, maybe unreplicable, subjective, unobservable. And if you compare this to the other approaches, such as the behaviourists, it certainly appears that way, that it is maybe a less scientific method, although he was the first psychologist. It's a less scientific method than maybe we would hold ourselves up to in more modern approaches. Nisbet and Wilson also suggested that as individuals we're pretty bad at understanding why we think things or why we perceive things the way we do, and so for Wundt to use introspection, which is essentially doing that, it's really not a good method of understanding people. You actually may be better at measuring more objective things, as I just mentioned in the psychology as a science thing there, in terms of maybe, I don't know, we measure all sorts, galvanic skin response, heart rate, maybe even physical observations of behaviour, such as if you're observing maybe development, children in playgrounds, are they being aggressive? You can actually measure, you can operationalize your variables and say, yeah, okay, I'm gonna measure number of punches thrown. That's going to be my aggression. So actually, that's more observable than the introspection that Wundt was looking at in his methods. So a bit of an evaluation of Wundt, and then finally the scientific method. I've kind of already mentioned the strengths when I was talking about it, in terms of it's based on evidence. So we've got things that we can point to. We're not just saying we think this is how something's happening. We're saying we're pretty sure this is how something's happening. Look, here's the evidence that suggests it, and you can go and observe that and test that yourself. Cause and effect is established in terms of, you can say, yep, we gave this person water, this person coffee, and the one that drank the coffee, they were more alert. So yeah, we've caused an effect on alertness. And another thing that's sometimes overlooked in terms of the scientific method, it's not stringent, it's not unmovable. We don't say this is how it is and that's it. If there's evidence that then comes to light that disproves a theory that was once held as being true, then science will change its view, and it will say, oh, actually no, this new these new findings actually support this other theory, and so it's movable, and it will change its viewpoint based on what's observed, which is, again, it is a benefit of the scientific method. It's not just saying this is what happens and this is how it is. Theories are tested, and they can change. There are weaknesses, however, of the scientific method, and actually there are people within psychology who really don't feel that the scientific method is the best way to test human beings. I've already mentioned earlier in the video that to test people, generally you have to take them out of their environment, how they live day to day, and when you do that, you lose parts of what it is. So actually, in this clinical sterile environment of a lab where you're just testing reaction time, you could say, oh well, this affects X affects Y. However, actually day to day, there are lots of other things that can be different, and so some people say that actually no, you can't really experimentally, scientifically test humans accurately. You need to look at them in their own environment, and there are ways of getting around that, but that's the biggest weakness directed towards the scientific approach, that it lacks this external validity. You're taking people out of the environment that you're trying to apply the results to, and that is an issue as well with inferences that sometimes have to be made. Again, if we're looking across the approaches, and you look at maybe the psychodynamic approach and Freud and his dream analysis, he said we dream things and you have to interpret them, and this is what they really mean. Well, there's inferences that are made there, which means that it's not exactly what's happening. You think it's what's happening, and it's not. And again, that can be an issue sometimes with the scientific method. And again, yeah, the humanists would suggest that yeah, we shouldn't be using necessarily this strict scientific method, because it's such complex behaviour, and humans are such complex beings that you have to take the whole person, and that's what the humanists would say. So there is a bit of an evaluation of each of those if you were to need it. And I say were to need it, and I can't obviously mean were to need it in terms of exams and what you're going to be assessed on. So if we kind of finish on that, then we go back to the specification. What I was trying to get across for you in this video was that first part of the approaches spec, the origins of psychology. So hopefully you're a bit more informed about that now, where psychology started from the bottom. Now I'm here, and kind of where it's kind of ended up now. So you should have an understanding of Wilhelm Wundt, who he is, what he did, his method of introspection, and then how that links into psychology maybe emerging as being seen as a bit of a science. How you could be assessed on that then, obviously this is a new specification, but some of the suggested questions here, and they'll be in various textbooks. I've used the Cara Flanagan and Mike Cardwell book for a lot of the information from this video. There's also the Greenhead book, which was Cara Flanagan again, et al. But some of the example questions they've got on there, define introspection. So hopefully you should be able to do that now in terms of the process of an individual looking into themselves and trying to discover why they're processing something in a particular way. And again, explain the emergence of psychology as a science. Hopefully you should be able to do that now with the timeline that was there. How has it gone to being a science, and how does Wundt fit into that, and how do the other approaches maybe fit into that? Those questions may be easy to answer. The introspection one you should be able to do, but the emergence of psychology as a science, you might get a better understanding of that once you've gone through maybe a bit more research methods and as well looked at some of the other approaches in more detail. But I hope you'll be able to give those questions a go. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the video. Post any questions you may have, and if I don't answer them, maybe someone else on the link will be able to. Until next time, thank you very much.